The red-haired man's brows furrowed slightly, but he remained composed as he opened his mouth to release a burst of crimson light, which instantly swept through the air until it was behind him. The burst of crimson light then transformed into a round crimson shield, and two sharp clangs rang out as the streaks of silver sword light pierced into the shield, sending sparks flying in all directions. The round shield shuddered slightly, but it was instantly able to stabilize itself again. However, before the red-haired man even had a chance to catch his breath, four more identical streaks of silver sword light emerged on either side of him before piercing toward him as well, and they were even faster than the precious streaks of sword light. The red-haired man's expression darkened slightly upon seeing this, and the giant sword in his hand suddenly began to glow radiantly, as four fiery crimson sword projections were released. All of the sword projections were giving off bursts of law power fluctuations, and they positioned themselves directly in the path of the four streaks of silver sword light. Three dull thumps rang out in succession as three streaks of silver sword light were intercepted before exploding alongside the sword projections that they had crashed into. But right as the final streak of silver sword light was about to clash against the sword projection that was in its path, the latter was suddenly moved slightly to the side. The streak of silver sword light just barely passed by the fiery sword projection, then abruptly appeared in front of the red-haired man's lower abdomen, before plunging down at an incredible speed. A hint of surprise flashed through Hanli's eyes upon seeing this. In the instant that the crimson sword projection was diverted to the side, Hanli had sensed the aura of spiritual sense chains. Right at this moment, a burst of radiant azure light abruptly appeared beside the red-haired man, then transformed into an azure spear that struck the streak of silver sword light. A dull thump rang out as the streak of silver sword light exploded, while the thin man appeared beside the red-haired man before asking, "Are you all right, Brother Gongshu?" A layer of cold sweat had beaded up on the red-haired man's forehead, and there was a hint of lingering fear in his eyes as he replied, "I'm fine. Thank you, Brother Wang." At the same time, he made a hand seal, and his giant sword rose up into the air above his head, where it released a burst of radiant crimson light that conjured up countless streaks of crimson sword chi, forming an enormous sword array that began revolving incessantly around him. At the same time, the crimson shield behind him transformed into a thick crimson light barrier around his entire body in case of further sneak attacks. Silver Fox may only be an early high zenith cultivator, but his powers are nothing to be scoffed at. Otherwise, he wouldn't have been able to avoid capture for all these years, so do be careful, Brother Gongshu, the thin man cautioned. At the same time, he swept a sleeve through the air to release an azure bamboo tube immortal treasure, while transformed into a cylindrical azure light barrier around him. The red-haired man nodded in response, and any complacency in his heart had been completely erased. Right at this moment, the black-robed young man's mocking voice rang out. "Gongshu Tian, I heard that you're supposed to be the #1 prodigy of the Gongshu clan, and a renowned figure even in the Immortal prison. Is this all of you've got? You have to rely on your companion to protect you? How disappointing." His voice was reverberating throughout the entire surrounding space, making it impossible to pinpoint where it was coming from. A furious look appeared on the red-haired man's face, but he then took a deep breath and paid no heed to the taunts being directed at him. "Even my spirit domain is unable to detect Silver Fox's presence. What type of law power has he mastered?" he asked through voice transmission while scouring his surroundings. "I'm not sure. I've heard that he possesses a powerful spatial treasure that can allow him to fuse as one with space itself, making it impossible to track him down using spiritual sense or spirit domains. Having said that, it's not entirely impossible to determine his location," the thin man replied. A hint of realization instantly appeared in the red-haired man's eyes upon hearing this. All of a sudden, a burst of azure light emerged over the thin man's body, and it spread outward to form an azure spirit domain that stacked on top of the surrounding crimson spirit domain. Immediately thereafter, he made a hand seal, and a series of azure tornadoes instantly emerged within the azure spirit domain. The red-haired man also sprang into action, chanting an incantation, and a series of pillars of crimson fire rose up within his spirit domain, quickly intertwining with the azure tornadoes. The fiery pillars quickly fused with the azure tornadoes, and the flames reared up significantly as the entire crimson spirit domain brightened by several fold, but no change could be observed in the azure spirit domain. However, all of the swirling crimson flames were obstructing everyone's view, while also keeping out the spiritual sense of the bystanders, and everyone was quite disappointed to see this, for the vast majority of the bystanders, witnessing high zenith cultivators in battle was an extremely precious learning experience, but it seemed that the spectacle had become inaccessible, at least for now. A hint of disappointment also flashed through Hanli's eyes, and a contemplative look appeared on his face as he thought back to the instant that the crimson sword projection had been shifted to the side. He hadn't managed to catch a clear glimpse of the process the first time, but if he could see it a few more times, then he was confident that he would be able to make sense of what had happened. This was clearly a very advanced use of one's spiritual sense, and if he could master it, he would have another potent weapon that he could use in battle. Inside the crimson spirit domain, the red-haired man made a hand seal, and the crimson flames within the spirit domain instantly began to churn violently, then converged to form a giant white fireball that resembled a scorching sun hanging in midair. A terrifying fiery law aura was emanating from the white sun, causing the nearby space to tremble violently. The red-haired man's complexion was slightly pale, clearly indicating that this was a very taxing ability for him to unleash, and he chanted an incantation while abruptly making a grabbing motion with one hand. Countless strands of white light instantly shot out of the white sun, then pierced through the space down below in a flash. The strands of white light were extremely fast, and they instantly permeated throughout the entire crimson spirit domain. There he is! The red-haired man's eyes suddenly lit up as he switched to a different hand seal, and countless strands of white light suddenly stretched taut as they dragged the black-robed young man out of thin air. Those strands of white light were wrapped around his body, and there was a surprised look on his face. Die! The thin man roared as he swept a sleeve through the air, sending an azure badge hurtling toward the black-robed young man. A dull thud rang out as the azure badge transformed into an azure beastly projection with the head of a snake and the body of a tiger mid-flight, then opened its mouth up wide as it pounced at the black-robed young man. The aura emanating from this projection was far more formidable than that of the thin man himself, and it was almost at the pinnacle of the high zenith stage. A grim look appeared on the black-robed young man's face as he hurriedly made a hand seal, and two bursts of bright silver light appeared in his eyes before quickly spreading over his entire body. Immediately thereafter, his body exploded into countless specks of silver light that dissipated in all directions. As a result, the azure beastly projection missed its target, and it let loose a frustrated roar before quickly reverting back to the same azure badge from before, except this time, the azure light emanating from it had dimmed significantly. Meanwhile, the specks of silver light converged in the distance to form Silver Fox's body once again, but his appearance had changed drastically. His hair had turned silver, as had his previously black pupils. His ears had elongated drastically, and a layer of silver fur had emerged over them. Wisps of misty silver light were revolving around him, giving him a rather indistinct and mysterious appearance. The thin man's expression darkened slightly upon seeing this, and he drew his azure badge back to himself while sweeping a sleeve through the air to release an antiquated azure mirror. As soon as the mirror appeared, a burst of azure light instantly flashed over its surface, and it swelled to the size of a house in the blink of an eye. Countless azure runes surged out of the mirror, then transformed into balls of azure light. At the same time, the thin man opened his mouth to release a ball of azure light, which intertwined with all of the balls of azure light, instantly transforming them into giant blades of azure wind, with arcs of azure lightning flashing over them. All of the blades of wind swept towards Silver Fox with incredible speed and tremendous power. While the red-haired man made a hand seal, and a second flurry of strands of white light erupted out of the white sun before hurtling towards Silver Fox as well. A disdainful sneer appeared on Silver Fox's face, and a burst of silver light flashed over his body before transforming into several dozen silver figures, all of which appeared to be clones of himself. These silver figures darted away in all directions, leaving trails of afterimages in their wake, and the blades of azure wind instantly swept through them, but were unable to inflict any damage at all. The strands of white light were also completely ineffective as they pierced through the silver figures. You two aren't half bad, but I've spent enough time playing with you. I still have things I need to do, so I'll be leaving now. See you never. Silver Fox's mocking voice rang out once again as the silver figures abruptly sped up while continuing to dart away, and they seemed to be completely unaffected by the two surrounding spirit domains. You're not getting away, the thin man roared as he flew into the air. Appearing above the antiquated azure mirror while making a hand seal, then opened his mouth to release a ball of blood essence that fused into the mirror. The mirror instantly lit up as a vast expanse of azure radiance surged forth from within. It was as if it had been set alight, and it took on a semi-transparent appearance before fusing into the azure spirit domain in a flash. The entire azure spirit domain instantly transformed into an enormous azure mirror surface, and bursts of translucent azure light surged out of the mirror while giving off peculiar law power fluctuations. All of the silver figures were instantly rooted to the spot, and at the same time, the thin man switched to a different hand seal before thrusting both of his palms down toward the mirror surface. Countless translucent azure threads shot out of the azure mirror surface before piercing through the silver figures, and this time they were finally able to harm those silver figures, which dissipated one after another until there was only a single one left.